Hello. This week we begin with Max Weber. Max Weber, along with Karl Marx and Emil Durkheim, is considered one of the founding fathers of the discipline of sociology. Unlike Marx, however, Weber is very interested in the realm of ideas. Although it must be said that it is the same concerns that trouble him, that bother him, that troubled Marx and Durkheim. All three of them are witnessing what we call the Great Transformation. The emergence of modernity, the kind of inequality that it brings along, and the immense shift in terms of technological things, but also in terms of how we work and the meanings we give to our work. So with Weber, we are going to get into the realm of meanings. He is, unlike Marx, more in the ideas realm and but also very observant of the material realm. He's growing up at a time when Marxism is very much of a prominent aspect of German society. And so he's quite well read with Marx. In fact, if you look at the timeline that I have up here, Weber is around 3 years old. He's born in 1864, so he's about 3 years old when Karl Marx publishes Das Kapital. So that's the realm of ideas Max Weber has grown up with. He also witnesses the Franco-Prussian War as a child, which leads to the unification of Germany. And in 1883, we see the standardization of Greenwich time. This is critical in our understanding of Max Weber because we see that he's also very intrigued by the standardization, the rationalization, and the kind of structured rationality, organization that becomes a realm of our everyday life at that time. In 1889, he writes his doctoral thesis on the medieval trade associations. Prior to that, he studied at Heidelberg. He also joined the military for some time and then came back to do his doctoral work. I've written other events in Germany, the fall of the Bismarck, which also was a key moment in the history of Germany in the transition between the more conservative but slower moving Germany to a faster paced Germany. Alongside in 1903, a year before Weber visits the United States, Henry Ford has set up his Ford Motor Company. The visit to the United States really influences Weber quite a bit, and he's in fact written about the fast frenzy of traffic and the dynamic motion of American everyday life. And that really intrigues him. He returns from there and writes The Protestant Ethic and The Spirit of Capitalism, one of his primary texts, along with others. In 1889, Max Weber founded the German Sociological Association. I'm sorry for the order, but I guess you still get the point. And 1914, the First World War begins. Other key essays of Weber, 1915 is the social psychology of world religions. In fact, he's been writing these essays on Hinduism or the religions of India, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, and those of China, Confucianism and Taoism, and several others on ancient Judaism. He's also studying Islam, apart from also studying Catholicism and Protestantism. But then he starts to bring all of that together in his texts. His other two essays, Politics as Vocation and Science as Vocation, really compel us to think about how to do really engaged and yet rationally planned, value-free social sciences. Then his magnum opus, Economy and Society, again built over several essays and then eventually compiled together into one volume by his wife after Weber's passing. With Weber, I've already spoken about some of the intellectual influences. Certainly German philosophy is one, as is Marxist thought as he's growing up. but also very influential for him was his family. So Weber grew up in the suburbs of Berlin, and his father was a businessman and a politician and a political figure and very active, as was his mother, a well-educated Protestant lady who brought in, the ideas of discipline and social service that Weber was heavily influenced by. I have a family picture of him up here, and I don't know if I'll be able to tell it quite well in this manner of presenting, but he's sitting on one side of his father is Weber and the other side is the rest of the family. So I guess you can probably make that out. One of his brothers also, Alfred Weber, in fact during their lifetime he was perhaps more well known than Weber in the discipline of economy. Like I said, his parents were both very active figures. Their house out in Berlin was always full of academics, politicians, artists. Sort of very vibrant intellectual environment is what he was exposed to as he was growing up. And he married Mariana, who was also a distant cousin, who herself was a highly accomplished intellectual, and she also wrote several texts. She can be called one of the early feminists. She's written on wifehood and motherhood in the context of law, held discussions and salons at home, and eventually ended up compiling a lot of Weber's work and making it accessible to the rest of us after he passed away. She also received an honorary doctorate eventually. So this is to kind of give you a sense of the kind of intellectual environment that surrounded him, even of like within the discipline of sociology. We are hailing here Max Weber as a key theorist. One should not forget the influence particularly of his mother and his wife in the context of his intellectual trajectory. Alright, so what did Weber try to do with sociology, and how was his sociology different from what, let's say, Marx was doing or what the political economists was doing? Weber is really bringing in the more interpretive, qualitative aspect into how we go about studying sociology. So very clearly he is not in the positivist kind of frame. He's very clearly breaking out of that, going into an understanding of subjective meaning. So I'll read out how he defines sociology. He certainly says that sociology is a science, although at several points you'll find him talking about or writing about how it differs from a natural science, because you cannot really predict social behavior and you cannot control it in the same way that you can do for the natural sciences. Sociology is a science concerning itself with the interpretive understanding of social action in order to arrive at a causal explanation of its course and effects. So two terms over here are very important. One is that it is an interpretive science. It is something where we interpret particular behaviors, social action, the kind of meanings people give to the things that they do. And the other is social action. So I want to go into how he defines social action. And for him, social action is anything that we ascribe a subjective meaning to. So any conscious action, according to Weber, would be social action. All conscious action would also be social in the sense that it is conditioned by things that surround us, by our beliefs, our religious beliefs, our upbringing, and so on. So most action in that is social action. I'll read out what he writes about social action in the methodology of the social sciences. In action is included all human behavior when insofar as the acting individual attaches a subjective meaning to it. So it's conscious and there is some meaning to that action. Action in this sense may be either overt or purely inward or subjective. It may consist of positive intervention in a situation, basically such that you do something, or of deliberately refraining from such intervention or passively acquiescing in the situation. So not acting when maybe an action was required is also social action, right? And also needs to be studied as part of sociology. Now, action is social insofar as, by virtue of the subjective meaning attached to it by the acting individual or individual, so it could be group, it takes account of the behavior of others and is thereby socially oriented in its course. So it is conditioned by others and it is kind of attaching meaning to it, and these meanings are social creations, and therefore subjective meaningful action is what constitutes the subject of the discipline of sociology as far as Weber is concerned. Now, meaning. He's talking about meaning. How do we understand meaning? And this could also be in many different ways. It could be concrete meaning in a specific case. We are sitting as part of a group and one person says something, everybody else continues, but one of the people in the group kind of gets hurt and gets up and leave. So as a sociologist, I could interpret that individual's action in the moment, in the context of that conversation. So it's a concrete meaning in a specific context. It could be typical average meaning for groups. Several people, we all often light candles or diyas on the occasion of certain festivals. It has a particular meaning of illumination taken philosophically, spiritually and culturally, which everybody who's participating in that social action understands either intuitively or quite explicitly, right? So if a sociologist is to go and study people lighting diyas, they would interpret it in part of the meanings that that group assigns to this particular act. Now, Weber, and on my next slide, I'll actually go on to defining the notion of ideal type. Weber actually gives us a method for studying social action, and he does that through a tool that he calls ideal type. Now, ideal type is a theoretical realm. It's ideal type is a yardstick that he puts forth as, okay, this, let's say it's like the notion of X maybe in mathematics. It's like, let's assume that these are the characteristics that are surrounding this particular kind of social group, and then we take that as a given and with that proceed. Now, he will only tell us that ideal type doesn't really exist in reality, but when we want to draw causal inferences about particular groups, it is important to make some of these characteristics explicit and stated as such. Then he says that the meanings we assign are a hypothesis. They are not metaphysical truths. So they are a process through which we do a sociological inquiry. That does not mean that they are the metaphysical truths. And that interpretation helps explain why actors behave as they do, but they are still also only interpretations and are subject to be challenged. Coming to his notion of ideal types, let me first read out what he has to say about it. I think it's quite self-explanatory. He says, an ideal type is formed by one-sided accentuation of one or more points of view and by the synthesis of a great many diffuse, discrete, more or less present and occasionally absent concrete individual phenomena, which are arranged according to those one-sidedly emphasized viewpoints into a unified analytical construct. That's what ideal types are, a unified analytical construct. So it's a construct nevertheless, but a construct created in order for us to proceed with our sociological analysis. In its conceptual purity, the mental construct cannot be found anywhere in reality, right? So it is an utopia, he says. Now, important to remember is that ideal type is a theoretical model, not a moral idea or a statistical average. This is important because this is his method of doing interpretive sociology. Ideal type serves as a yardstick to understand deviations and variations, and it helps produce causal explanations by isolating and accentuating the logic of different social actions. Now, I have put up an example here from Weber himself of how he would go about creating these analytical mental constructs. So, if he has an analytical mental construct or an ideal type of the craft-oriented society and an ideal type of a capitalist society, for the craft-oriented society, Weber would put the characteristics of small independent craftsmen. Here, artisan owns their tools, guilds control competition, so you can't kind of grow in the way that one grows under capitalism, and that there is a strong emphasis on tradition. Now, these characteristics are central to what a craft-oriented society is. On the other hand, a capitalist, the ideal type for a capitalist society would involve systematic rational organization in order to make more and more profit, right? Owners are separate from workers in a capitalist society. There is the class which owns the means of production, and there is the wage working class. There is free market and labor. Free labor that sells itself in the market. And there is a strong emphasis on accumulation, right? Contrary to the strong emphasis on tradition in a craft-based society. So, while we understand that even within capitalist societies, there might be people who are craft-oriented, right? Who do their work in a different manner. And even within craft-oriented society, there might be people who are very interested in more accumulation or more systematic and organized. But in order for us to do a systematic analysis, it is important to identify the ideal type and then go from there in terms of making comparisons and inferences, deviations, and understanding any causal linkages or aberrations. Alright, so then he comes to talking about different types of social action, different types of action that have subjective meaning to them. And here he goes in a different tangent than what economists would perhaps argue, where the notion that action is usually rational, it is driven by self-interest. Here he wants to go into more detail and look at various kinds of action, not necessarily all rational, yet all of them that have subjective meanings assigned to them by the one who is acting. So the first one he calls goal rational action. He also at times calls it instrumental rational action. This is in some ways the most rational because the goal is rationally thought out and the means of coming towards that goal or the end and the goal are both rationally planned, and you don't let your ideas or ideals or passions kind of interfere with this very rational instrumental strategizing and planning in the way you act. So let me give you an example. So this could be, let's say, a corporation that wants to maximize its profit. So that is the goal, and in order to do so, it will need to lay off workers. So it goes about systematically planning and figuring out how best to lay off their workers so as to make the corporation more efficient. Now the owner of that organization might have values of empathy for the workers or might feel compassionate or bad about letting them off, but in instrumental rational action you would go about strictly following the logic or the rationale that has been strategically planned. You could take it as, in your context, perhaps some of you might have wanted to get into a particular college or a university, and you knew that for that you needed to attain a certain amount of percentage or pass a particular exam, and so you plan your preparation for that examination in a strategic and a rational manner, oftentimes giving up what might be your other passions or other ways that you might have wanted to engage yourself. This is instrumental rational action. That is the first kind of social action that he defines. The other is value rational action. Now, an action, according to Weber, can be rational in so that it is planned and strategic and well thought about, but can be driven by something that is totally value based. For example, if I am very patriotic, nationalist, and maybe even in the military, I know that I have to fight for my country, and that that's my value, and I uphold it higher than everything else. Now, in the context of let's say a war, I would strategically plan to go about a certain action, even if I know that I myself might perish or be martyred in the process. But my action, which is very well planned, is actually driven by a value that to some others may not appear very rational. Like you are letting go of your self-interest in order to plan for something else which is a different value. At a mundane, everyday kind of a level, think about going on a date with a partner whom you really adore, and therefore will perhaps give up on something else to go with them for, but that going process you will maybe calculate that this is a restaurant that I can afford, this is a restaurant that I cannot afford. So there is rational planning involved, but it's driven by values of love and adoration and wanting to spend time with a loved one. So that is the second kind. These are two kinds of actions that can be driven by total instrumental logic or a value logic, but are still both rational. Now, there are two other kinds of actions that he gives, which are also social actions in that they have a subjective meaning, but that subjective meaning doesn't necessarily need to be rational. So, affective basically is emotional action. Affective action is, if I act out of anger, or if I act out of a lot of love for my children, and don't necessarily look at the planning or the strategy of how to go about doing what I'm doing. I just do it for the sake of love, or in the spur of the moment of when I'm very, very angry. So that kind of an action driven by emotions is an affective action, because it still has a subjective meaning attached to it, right? It is out of a particular emotion that action is emerging. The fourth kind of action, which also is actually very important in the context of a sociological study of social action, is, he calls it, traditional action. Traditional action is things that we do because they are part of our custom, they are part of our habit, they are part of the rituals that we have grown up with, without necessarily always thinking about why we are doing them, but we are conditioned to do those actions in the way that we perform them. In the Indian context, for example, we often touch the feet of our elders. Now, this is a traditional action which is hard to justify using a particular rational, but it has a strong subjective meaning for both the one who is doing it and the one for whom he or she is doing it, right? So, or laying the table in a particular way, or the act of cutting a cake in a birthday. I mean, these are all traditions and customs that are associated with particular cultures, and we act in those ways because we inherit those customs and rituals. All right, so I want to, towards the end, talk very briefly about how Weber thinks we should be doing sociology. And for Weber, he wants us to do what he calls value-free sociology, but he does not think that value-free sociology means that we would not have any passion or love for the subject that we are studying. So in fact, he thinks that we all perhaps will choose what we want to research or study based on our interest or based on our experience when something is meaningful to us. But once we've chosen that this is what we want to study, then we need to go about it in a methodical, rational and rigorous manner, and that is when it is the kind of sociology that we should be doing. So with that, I will end today's lecture. Thank you.